set the mug down in front of me like she was doing me a favor. Earl Grey. My favorite. The same tea I'd been drinking every Sunday morning for 40 years, since before her husband was born. She smiled at me across the kitchen island. That particular smile she'd been wearing more and more lately. The one that didn't quite reach her eyes. My daughter-in-law, Brooke, 34 years old, dental hygienist. The kind of woman who alphabetizes her spice rack and keeps receipts for everything. I'd liked her once. I'd even told my son he'd done well. I reached for the mug. The smell was right. The color was right. But something in the way she was watching me, standing very still, arms folded across her chest, head tilted just slightly, made me set it back down without drinking. I said I needed to use the bathroom first. She said, of course, take your time. I went down the hall. I didn't use the bathroom. I stood in the shadow of the doorway, and I listened to her open a drawer, and then I heard the soft, papery sound of something being folded and tucked away quickly. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a pipe fitter in northern Alberta. I've worked in -40 temperatures. I have negotiated contracts with men twice my size, and I've learned, the hard way, that when something feels wrong, it usually is. I went back to the kitchen, I drank the tea, and I started paying very close attention. My name is Gordon Aldrich. No, that's not right. I keep mixing myself up at the TV. My name is Frederick Holt. Fred to the men at the Union Hall. Frederick to my mother, God rest her. Dad to my son, my only child, my boy James. James is 38 now. He has my jaw and his mother's eyes, and a habit of nodding along to things he doesn't actually agree with. We were close when he was young. We fished the North Saskatchewan together every summer. I taught him to change his own oil, to read a contract, to never sign anything he hadn't read twice. His mother, Vivian, died of ovarian cancer 11 years ago, and for a while after that, we were close in a different way. Quieter, more careful with each other. The way you are with someone who has seen the same fire. Then he met Brooke. I want to be fair. I tried, in the beginning. I took them to dinner. I remembered her birthday. I asked about her job. But Brooke had a way of making ordinary kindness feel like a negotiation, like every gesture of mine came with a price she'd already decided wasn't worth paying. She wasn't cruel. She was something worse than cruel. She was indifferent. To me, specifically. I was an inconvenience in the story she was telling herself about her own life. She began on James slowly, the way cold gets into a house. Not all at once, but through the cracks you don't notice until you're already shivering. First it was Sunday dinners, then it was the fishing trips. Then it was my calls going to voicemail. The return calls getting shorter, the pauses getting longer. James had always been conflict-averse. His mother used to joke that he'd apologize to a door if he walked into it. Brooke knew exactly what to do with a man like that. I live in Red Deer, Alberta. I own a house on a quiet street near the river, the same house where James grew up, where Vivian planted her garden. It's a modest place. A 1970s bungalow with original hardwood and a basement I finished myself the year James turned 12. The street is changing. Young families, renovations, money moving in. I know what the lot is worth. I'm not naive. What nobody knows. Not James, not Brooke, not the neighbors I wave to on morning walks, is that the house is the least of what I have. I was never a flashy man. I drove a 2009 Ford F-150 I kept in good condition. I wore the same Canada Goose jacket I bought in 2014. I ate at Tim Hortons 3 mornings a week because I liked the coffee and I liked the people. To anyone looking, I was a retired tradesman living quietly on a pension. What I actually had was different. In 1998, I invested money from a workplace settlement into a small oil field service company that a friend from the hall was starting up. I put in $40,000. I told Vivian it was probably gone. She said she knew, and she wasn't angry, and that was the kind of woman she was. The company grew. I reinvested. I bought shares in a Calgary-based energy trust before the income trust boom. I sold at the right time. I moved the money into rental properties in Leduc and Spruce Grove when nobody wanted them. I sold those at exactly the right time, too. I was not a genius. I was patient and I was stubborn, and I had a friend who was good with numbers, a man named Roy, who'd been my accountant since the 90s, and who knew every detail of what I was worth, and who didn't tell a living soul. By the time Brooke poured that cup of tea, I had just over $2.4 million in registered and non-registered accounts, 2 investment properties in Alberta, and a share in a commercial building in Red Deer that Roy managed through a numbered company. My monthly pension and CPP came to about $3,000. That's all James thought I had. I went home that Sunday afternoon and I called Roy from my landline. I told him something was off. I told him about the drawer and the folded paper and the way she'd stood watching me. Roy had known me since before James was born. He didn't ask me if I was being paranoid. He said, "All right, Freddie, let's see what we're dealing with." It took him 4 days. Brooke had contacted 2 elder care lawyers in Edmonton. She had made inquiries, not on behalf of a client, not out of curiosity. Specific inquiries about the process for applying for guardianship over a parent who was showing signs of cognitive decline. She had requested information packages about assisted living facilities in Red Deer and the COM. She had printed documents about the Alberta Adult Guardianship and Trusteeship Act. That was what had been in the drawer. I sat with that information for a long time. I sat in Vivienne's garden, in the lawn chair I'd never moved from the spot she liked, and I let myself feel it, not the anger that came later. First, there was the thing underneath the anger, the thing I didn't have a clean word for. It was grief, I think, not for what was happening, but for what it meant had already happened. The James erased would not have let this woman make phone calls about putting his father in a care home. Somewhere between the fishing trips and the granite countertops in their new house, my son had stopped being mine. I went back inside. I made myself dinner. I watched the news. I called Roy back and I said, very quietly, "I need you to help me do something." Roy listened. Then I started acting confused. It wasn't difficult. I had a knee surgery 2 years prior and I'd started using a cane on bad days. I leaned on it more now. I called James twice to ask him the same question about the furnace filter. I left a message for Brooke about a Sunday dinner we'd never planned. I let myself go slightly around the edges, a shirt untucked, shoes on the wrong feet once when she came to pick me up. Nothing dramatic, just enough to confirm what she already believed. Just enough to give her confidence. She began coming to the house more often. She was considerate about it, bringing grocery bags, asking about my medications. The way you handle someone you've already decided is fragile. She started organizing things I hadn't asked her to organize. She photographed the inside of my fridge. She sent James reports, which I know because Roy has a contact who knows about these things, and because James started calling me to ask careful, probing questions that didn't sound like his questions. They sounded like Brooke's questions, filtered through his voice. "I love you, son. I hope you know that, wherever you are in the story." 3 weeks in, she found the filing cabinet. I had left it unlocked on purpose. Inside was a folder, not my real financial records, which Roy kept off-site, but a folder I had prepared, full of savings account statements and pension paperwork and a copy of the title to the house. Everything looking modest and straightforward. Everything suggesting that the sum total of Frederick Holt's life was a paid-off bungalow and a government pension. She was in that room for 45 minutes. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the filing cabinet open and close. I heard the soft sound of papers being photographed on a phone. I sat with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I kept my face very still, and I thought about patience, and about the 31 winters I'd worked outside, and about how long it takes for steel to set. She came out, and she was pleasant. She asked if I'd eaten lunch. She said James would be by on the weekend. She left. I went downstairs to the corner of the unfinished utility room, where I keep tools and old sporting equipment. Behind a shelf of paint cans that hadn't moved in a decade, I had placed a small voice recorder the week prior. I retrieved it. I plugged it into my laptop. She had made a phone call from my kitchen while I sat in the living room. I could hear, in the background, the faint sound of the television I had left on. She was talking to James. "I'm telling you," she said. "The folder in the cabinet. The house is worth maybe $600, $650 now with the market, plus the pension. That's it. He's got a savings account with about 40,000. That's everything, James. We're not talking about a complicated estate. We're talking about a straightforward transfer if we have guardianship. The care home in Lacombe, the one I toured, it's actually quite good. He'd be comfortable. And the house, we listed in spring. We clear 400 after the mortgage and fees, and that handles the line of credit. We just need to move before it gets any worse, before he decides to give something away, or before some caregiver gets her hooks in. James said something I couldn't make out. Brooke said, I know, but you have to think about us. I pressed stop on the recording. I sat in the utility room for a while. The furnace kicked on and ran its cycle and shut off again. I could hear the house settling around me, the way old houses do in Alberta winters, the wood contracting in the cold. I thought about Vivienne. I thought about the way she used to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the crossword, and how she'd read me the clues she was stuck on, and how I almost always knew the answers because she'd tell me the ones she already had. That was our system. That was us. I thought about James standing at our kitchen table at age 9, refusing to sit down until I taught him how to properly shake hands. He'd been very serious about it. He wanted to do it right. Then I thought about what I needed to do. Roy came by that evening. We sat at the kitchen table with the recorder between us, and he listened to the whole thing with his reading glasses on. Though there was nothing to read, just a habit he had. When it was done, he took them off and folded them carefully and put them in his shirt pocket and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, All right, Freddie, let's talk about what happens next. Roy's son-in-law, as it happened, was a partner at a firm in Edmonton that handled elder law, estates, and financial fraud. Roy had already made a quiet call. The firm had a colleague in the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit who had seen this exact pattern before. Adult children, deteriorating parent, a vulnerable adult designation pursued, not out of care but out of financial positioning. There was a word for it. Roy said the word carefully, like he didn't want to drop it. The word was exploitation. We spent 3 hours at that table. By the end of it, I had a plan that was thorough, legal, and, I'll be honest, satisfying in the way that a precisely fitted joint is satisfying. Everything in its right place. Every piece load-bearing. The following Monday, I called James. I told him I was worried. I said my memory had been slipping more than I let on. I said I thought maybe Brooke was right, that I needed some help, that I'd been thinking about what would happen to the house, to my things, if I couldn't manage anymore. I said I wanted to get my affairs in order while I still could. I asked if he and Brooke could come down that weekend. He sounded relieved. Brooke sounded like a woman who had won something. They came on Saturday. I had made coffee and there were biscuits from the bakery on Gates Avenue because Brooke liked them, or had once mentioned she did, and I was, in the end, still a man who remembered what people liked. James looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. He hugged me longer than he usually did, and I held on, and I thought, there you are. We sat at the kitchen table. I had a folder out, the real one this time, though not the real version. A middle version, enough to look plausible. Brooke had brought a document. She produced it with the practiced casualness of someone who has rehearsed this moment. A personal directive and a healthcare proxy, she said. Just so we know your wishes are on paper. She had a second document behind it, which she described as a general power of attorney. She said it was standard. She said it would just make things simpler if I needed them to manage things down the road. She'd had it drafted by a lawyer. The power of attorney was broad. It would have given them control over my bank accounts, my investment decisions, the sale of my property, everything. I picked up the pen she slid across the table. James watched me. He wasn't unkind, my son. He was weak. He was doing the thing he had always done, nodding along to something he didn't fully believe because someone more decisive had decided it was happening. I held the pen for a long moment. I looked at Brooke. She gave me that smile again. Then I set the pen down. I said, I think I'd like Roy to look at this first. Brooke's smile tightened. She said, of course, totally reasonable. We just thought since you'd said you wanted to get things organized. She was still talking when the front door opened. Roy walked in. He had a key. He had always had a key. Behind Roy was a woman I introduced as his colleague, which was true. She was also an officer with the RCMP Elder Abuse Unit out of the Red Deer Detachment, which I did not say yet. Roy set a binder on the kitchen table. Brooke looked at the binder. She looked at Roy. She looked at me. I sat up straight. I realized later that she must have noticed it in that exact moment, the change in how I was sitting. The cane was leaning against the wall. I wasn't reaching for it. My eyes were not vague or wandering. I was looking directly at her with the complete and focused attention of a man who has been waiting 3.5 weeks for this particular moment. Roy opened the binder. The first page was a transcription of the phone call she'd made from my kitchen. Brooke's hand moved toward the document she'd brought. James caught her wrist, not deliberately, just reflex. Like he'd reached for something solid and it happened to be her arm. He was staring at the transcription. That's my voice, he said. He said it quietly, not as an accusation, but as a man confirming something to himself. The second page was a summary prepared by Roy's son-in-law's firm, a legal assessment of the power of attorney document Brooke had just placed on my table. The assessment used specific language: overreach, undue influence, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which under the Adult Interdependent Relationships Act in Alberta carried specific consequences. The document Brooke had drafted wasn't just aggressive. In the opinion of Roy's son-in-law, who had 30 years of estates experience, it constituted an attempt to defraud. Brooke said, "This is insane." She said, "Fred, you told James you wanted to get things organized." She said, "We were trying to help." I said, "I know what you told my son. I heard you say it." She looked at the recorder sitting on the counter behind me. She had seen it when she walked in. She'd assumed it was a clock. James was very still. I looked at him. I have thought a great deal about what to say in a moment like this, how to speak to a son who has let himself be led somewhere he knew was wrong. I had rehearsed several versions. In the end, I didn't use any of them. I just said his name. James. He looked up. I said, "I need you to understand what she was trying to do. Not what she told you she was trying to do, what she was actually doing." Roy walked him through it. The inquiries to the elder care lawyers, the guardianship research, the care home tour in Lacombe, the timeline, which showed that Brooke had begun this process 8 months ago, well before I had shown any signs of confusion, before I had given her any reason to believe I needed help. 8 months ago, James had been laid off from his position at an engineering firm, a fact I had learned from Roy and not from my son. They had a line of credit that had been maxed out for 14 months. They had a mortgage on a house they could not sustain on Brooke's income alone. James listened to all of this with his hands flat on the table, like a man bracing himself. Then Roy turned to the last section of the binder. This part I had debated including. Roy had counseled me to, said it would be important for James to understand the full picture. I had agreed, but sitting there watching my son's face, I wasn't sure. The last section was a summary of my actual financial position. I watched James read it. I watched his expression move through several things I don't have words for. He was a smart man, my son. He understood immediately what it meant. Not just the number, though the number was significant. He understood what it meant that I had never told him. He understood what it meant that I had let him believe, for his entire adult life, that I was comfortable, but not wealthy, careful, but not strategic, retired, but not powerful. He understood, I think, that I had been waiting to see what kind of man he would become. He said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I wanted to see what you'd do when you thought there was nothing to want." He looked down at the table. Brooke stood up. She said this was entrapment, which it wasn't. She said I had led them on deliberately, which was true, but not illegal. She said she needed to call her own lawyer, which was her right. Roy's colleague from the RCMP unit spoke for the first time then, calmly and clearly, and explained to Brooke what had been filed that morning with the Crown Prosecutor's office in Red Deer and what the process would look like from here. "I won't tell you," Brooke cried. She didn't. She sat back down, and she got very quiet and very still. And she looked at me with something that I can only describe as the expression of a person who has finally been accurately appraised, like she'd been presenting herself at evaluation for years, and someone had finally looked at the foundation and told her what was actually there. James did not defend her. That was the thing I remember most about that afternoon, in all the years of her chipping away at the distance between us, of his silent nodding, of his voice delivering her conclusions. When it mattered, when it was real and documented and sitting in a binder on the kitchen table, he did not defend her. He just sat there. The process took 7 months. Brooke was charged under Section 331 of the Criminal Code of Canada, theft by a person holding power of attorney, and additionally faced civil action for the documented financial exploitation attempt. Her lawyer negotiated. The Crown proceeded. She pled guilty to a reduced charge, received a conditional sentence and 2 years of supervised probation, was ordered to perform community service hours and repay legal costs, and received a criminal record that will follow her in a province where professional licensing matters. They separated before the case was resolved. James filed in December. I did not tell my son to leave her. I did not ask him to. That was his decision, made the way real decisions are made. Slowly, quietly, in the privacy of his own understanding of what he could and couldn't live with. He called me on a Tuesday evening in February, a few months after the charges were laid. He said he wanted to come for dinner. Just dinner, nothing formal. I made roast chicken and boiled potatoes and the kind of gravy Vivienne used to make from the drippings. We sat at the kitchen table and ate without talking much, the way we used to when he was a teenager, and easy silence was something we were both good at. After, he helped me with the dishes, which he hadn't done since he was a boy. Standing at my elbow, passing me things to dry, he said, "I should have seen it sooner." I said, "You saw it when it counted." He said, "Dad," and then he stopped. He tried again. He said, "I'm sorry for how far away I got." I handed him back the pot to put away because I didn't know where she'd moved it to. He knew where it went. People asked me sometimes, strangers, sometimes Roy over a beer, sometimes the men at the hall who have heard pieces of this story, whether I would have done anything differently, whether I should have said something sooner, confronted James earlier, been more forthcoming about my own finances, whether I caused some of this by being private, by keeping my own counsel so thoroughly that my son never had the full picture. I think about it. I'm not going to pretend I don't. Here's what I believe. Money doesn't make people. It reveals them. I kept my financial life private not out of secrecy, but out of respect. For James, for his independence, for the belief that a son should build himself from what he has inside, not from the expectation of inheritance. I was wrong to let the distance grow without addressing it. I was not wrong to want to know who my son was apart from what he stood to gain. Those are 2 different failures, and only one of them is mine. The house is still on the river street. The garden has been cleared for winter now, but I'll put in some perennials in spring. Vivienne always liked the ones that came back on their own. James comes for dinner most Sundays. He started fishing again. Last September, we drove up toward Rocky Mountain House and went out on the clear water for 2 days, just the 2 of us, which is what it always was, which is what it should be. I am 67 years old. I have my health, more or less. I have Roy, who has been wrong about exactly 2 things in 30 years and has the grace to remember both of them. I have my boy, who is finding his way back to the man I raised. And I have a lesson that cost more than I expected and that I will not forget. Your family does not own you because you share a name. Your love is not a liability someone else gets to manage. Silence is sometimes patience, and patience is sometimes the only power you have. But when someone tries to take what is yours, not just your money, not just your house, but your dignity, your autonomy, your right to be a full person in your own life, you do not owe them your confusion. You owe them your clarity. I am Frederick Holt, and I was not confused, not for a single moment. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to Ruthless Vengeance. There are more stories like this one coming, and I read every comment that comes in. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me this. Would you have confronted your son before it got that far, or would you have waited and built the case the way I did? I want to know what you think. I've had a lot of time to think about how it all unfolded. Not with regret, exactly. More like the way you review a job after it's done, looking for the places you could have worked cleaner, faster, with less waste. That's the pipe fitter in me. You don't walk away from a finished system without checking your joints one more time. What Brooke did wasn't complicated. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of betrayal. It doesn't require genius. It just requires a person who has decided that someone else's life is a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. She looked at me, and she saw square footage and account balances, and a problem to be solved before it got more complicated. She wasn't wrong that I was getting older. She was wrong about what that meant. And James. I've sat with James's part in this longer than anything else. He didn't devise the plan. He didn't make the phone calls or draft the power of attorney or tour the care home in Lacombe. But he drove her there. He asked me her questions. He nodded when you should have pushed back, and he stayed quiet when the quiet was its own kind of answer. I raised him to shake hands properly and read before he signed and say what he meant, even when it was hard. Somewhere along the way, he stopped doing those things, and I have to live with the question of how much of that was me. My privacy, my distance, my belief that a man should figure things out for himself. I think what happened between us was a slow erosion, not a single failure, but 1,000 small surrenders on both our parts. I kept my financial life private because I believed it would protect him from expectation. What I didn't consider was that it also protected me from being fully known. And a man who isn't fully known by his own son is a man who has left a gap that someone else can fill with whatever story serves them best. The cause always precedes the consequence. I know that. The distance I allowed created the conditions Brooke moved into. That's not absolution for what she did. She made her own choices, clearly and deliberately. And she is living with the results of those choices now. But I can hold two things at the same time. She was wrong, and I wasn't entirely right. What I keep coming back to is the idea of clarity, not cleverness. I want to be clear about that, because this story could easily be read as a man who outmaneuvered someone, and that's not what I think it was. What saved me was not the recordings or the binder or Roy's contacts. What saved me was that I knew my own mind. When she handed me that tea and stood there watching, something in me recognized the shape of what was happening before I had the words for it. 31 winters in the field teaches you that. Your body learns to read the signs before your brain catches up. The smell of a gas line, the sound a joint makes before it fails, the silence that means something has gone wrong inside a wall you can't see into yet. Trust that. Whatever it is in you that knows before it knows, trust it. Don't talk yourself out of it to be polite. Don't set it aside because the alternative is uncomfortable. Sit with it. Investigate quietly. Build your understanding before you move. And if someone in your life is treating your age, your quietness, or your kindness as a weakness, let me tell you, from the other side of it, it is not a weakness. It is information. It tells you exactly who they are and exactly what you need to do next. James comes for dinner on Sundays now. He brought fish last time, already cleaned. We didn't talk about any of it. We just cooked and ate and washed up, and that was enough. That was more than enough.